Just for funsies, I made a class version of the same component that you can access right here. And if you have experience with classes, then this could be helpful for you to see how you can migrate from classes to hooks. But if you don't have experience with classes, then go ahead and skip this because every day classes become less and less relevant. And you can come back here if you ever need to write a class component. All right, so we've got our board, we've got the React component, we have the squares initialized to what's coming from local storage. So we are storing this in local storage. We have a select square, our render square, restart, component did mount, component did update to keep our local storage up to date with this update local storage method. And then we have a render function that resembles very closely to what our board function component looks like. So let's go ahead and get this thing refactored. First, I'm going to make a function called board. And I pretty much start from the top and go down. So starting from our state, we need to manage some state called squares. So I'm going to make a use state called squares and set squares. And then here we're doing this JSON parse thing. And one thing to note about React component is that this initialization happens during the constructor phase. And so that in itself is kind of lazy. It only happens when this is constructed, whereas this use state is going to get called on every render of the component. And so in our case, we want to do a lazy initialization of this because we're reading into local storage and parsing that value, and that could be a bottleneck. So we're going to do a lazy initialization with that arrow function there, and now we can get rid of that state. Cool, we've managed the state. Next, we have this select square function that we're going to be using. So I'm going to just grab all that and move it up. And then we'll say function select square. Ta-da! And then anywhere that I see this inside of anything that I move into the function component, I got to change that because you can't use this inside a function component. So where am I going to get my squares? Well, it looks like I actually just have the squares right there. So I'll just get rid of this line entirely. And all the squares, it's just going to reference that. Boy, that's simpler. Awesome. And then here's another instance of this where we don't want that. We are going to just say we are not updating state with this.setState anymore. We have a setSquares function that we can call. So I'll just call setSquares with that squares copy, and boom, we're done. All right, moving on to the next, this render square. We can just take that, move that up here, and we could do const render square here just like that, and that'll work just fine. No longer do we need this dot anymore because we have select square just available in our closure. So that works out fine. And then our squares, that's just coming right from the closure as well. Sweet. Looking good so far. And then our restart. So let's move that restart up here. And there we go. Instead of this dot set state, we're going to just say set squares. And then we need to update local storage when we restart. Well, that's actually interesting. I'm going to go ahead and just comment that out and add a to-do handle this. We'll deal with that later. Okay, cool. So moving on, component did mount this update local storage. Now, component did mount is pretty similar to use effect. At least it's similar in what you're trying to accomplish. You use these lifecycle methods to synchronize the state of your component with the state of the world. In our case, that state of the world is this update local storage. And we're going to use a use effect instead. So I like to put all of my hooks up toward the top. So I'm going to do a React use effect. And use effects run for mount and for update. And if I look at the way that this is written, I want that update local storage to happen here. So I'm just going to copy the contents of that function and put it right in there. And no longer do we need to do this dot state anymore. We'll just do squares. And then if we come down here and look at our update, we are comparing the previous state squares with the current state of squares. And that's basically what use effect does out of the box. So we just put squares in here and we'll only update local storage if the squares change. Cool. That's exactly what we are intending with these lifecycle hooks. So we can get rid of those and we no longer need this update local storage thing. The only reason we had it was so we don't have to duplicate ourselves between both of these lifecycle methods like this. Because, yeah, ain't nobody want that. But we don't need to worry about that because our use effect handles both of these. So let's just get rid of that. That's nice. And then this is my favorite part. The render method, you just take the whole thing wholesale and stick it at the bottom. And that is the rest of our board. Now we just need to clean up anywhere where it says this. And we are good to rock and roll. So here we're getting the squares from this dot state. But squares is just in our closure available right there. So we don't need that anymore. Get rid of that. And let's see, we've got this dot restart. We don't need that anymore because restart is just right in our closure as well. Sweet. And then we've got this dot for render square. All of those are available as well. So we'll just delete this dot for those. Awesome. All right, so let's talk about this update local storage that we had before. So as it turns out, the coder who built the class version of this component was updating local storage unnecessarily, because doing this dot set state that we had before would trigger a re-render, and our component did update would have gotten run and will update local storage anyway. But this is the kind of mistake that we just don't make with React hooks and useEffect, because what we're thinking about when we're talking about useEffect is synchronizing the state of the world with the state of our application. And we don't need to worry about synchronizing those things manually anymore, because all we need to do is make sure we update the state of our application, and the state of the world will follow because of our useEffect. So we just get rid of that entirely. And with that, we are finished. Let's just make sure that O can win. Sweet. Everything seems to be working. If I do a refresh, then yep, we still have our game. We can hit restart, we can refresh, we can hit restart and refresh, and all of those things are still working with our new function version of this. Now, let's take this a step further, and remember, we do have a sweet hook that we can use with our utils here. So this is use local storage state. Ta-da! We're going to say use local storage state instead of use state. We'll say squares, and then instead of all of this nonsense, that's going to be managed by our custom hook. So we can get rid of all that. Ta-da! And everything's still working. I can still refresh. I can still restart. All of that is working perfectly, and it's all built into our use local storage state. Try to make something like that with a class component. It's not fun. You have to jump into render props or higher order components. Nobody wants any of that nonsense. Thank you, React hooks, for making logic reuse dead simple. So in review, we basically just went top to bottom in our class component and moved things to hooks. There's not really a set amount of rules or anything you can follow. You have to just kind of analyze each thing as it comes. But when we were managing state, we used use state, and then ultimately we used the use local storage state. And then we pulled in the select square function. Anywhere where we saw this dot, we just removed this dot and referenced what that was supposed to be referencing instead. We also moved our render square, did the same thing with that, and our restart did the same thing with that. And then we pulled our render function out and just copy and pasted that, removed all the this dots everywhere there. And we also managed to pull our component did mount, component did update into a useEffect, which ultimately we were able to remove thanks to the logic reuse that we have from this use local storage state custom hook. Pretty rad.